Hi, I'm Kathleen Carlson. Today is my 36th wedding anniversary, and I thought it was the perfect day to talk about my arranged marriage. Now, I know this concept is a little foreign to most people in this country, at least in the USA. I am located in Montana, but I was living in an ashram in a spiritual community in my 20s, and I did have an arranged marriage during that time. So for me, it was actually a good thing because I had been through some traumatic experiences earlier in life, sexual abuse, and particularly sexual abuse by a priest, and then also a dramatic and unfortunate marriage in my very early 20s while I was still in college. So for me, I had sort of sworn off relationships, period. I literally, if anyone asked me out, I would tell them, I don't date, my life is dedicated to God. So I had been on a spiritual path very seriously from the time I was in my mid-teens. And when I arrived at the spiritual community that I was part of for 10 years, I had no intention of marrying anyone. I was done. In fact, I was still in the middle of getting a divorce from the man that I'd been married to in my early 20s. So I was not interested in that. So I thought it would be interesting to tell this story. My husband says that on my channel, I talk a lot about principles, about symbolism, do a lot of sacred music and mantras, but I don't reveal a lot about myself. And so he asked for it, and we'll start with him. I arrived in the spiritual community. I was about 25 years old at that point, and had just finished college. So I was in and out of school for over 7 years before I finally finished a degree. It was very, very tumultuous between about 15 and 25, and those are stories for another time. So I arrived there, and I was working in the kitchen mainly. I was serving food. I love to cook, and I had learned natural foods cooking. It was actually the third spiritual community that I was in. I had been part of one that was Quaker-based, and then for a very short time I was part of one that was Sufi-based, and then the one that I was in for a longer period of time was more universalist, more New Age, studying all different world religions, practicing a form of chanting, prayers that were spoken out loud, and a very strict celibate community, really, a monastic community. So there were married couples, but if you were interested in anyone, it wasn't something that you arranged yourself. It was something that was arranged by the guru. There was a woman who was a guru, and you would contact her, usually in written form, in a written letter, and you would say, I'm interested in so-and-so. Do I have permission to get to know them? In other words, you needed permission to even have conversations with the opposite sex. There was a time limit of 10 minutes on how long you could talk with someone else who was the opposite sex. So you didn't have meals with them, you didn't share books with them, you didn't watch movies, you worked. We were absolutely dedicated. We were either in a religious service or we were working, and that basically filled your days, 7 days a week. So there wasn't a lot of social time, and so those things just weren't part of your life. But if you were interested in someone and you were interested in being a householder, which meant that you would have a partner and perhaps have a family, then you would write and you would get a response. And if the guru did not think that this was an appropriate match for you, then you would be told so. No, you're not allowed to get to know this person. And if a couple really was adamant that they wanted to be together and they didn't have the approval, then they would just leave. You could not do that within the community. If there was someone who was interested in you and the guru thought that it was an appropriate match, that did not mean that you had to marry that person. So this was not. An arranged marriage is different from a forced marriage. These were not forced marriages. They were simply something that had to be approved and had to be arranged by the guru in the community. So you didn't just decide that you were going to marry someone or you were going to start dating someone or whatever. So at any rate, what happened with me was I arrived there having no interest in in getting married again. The first one was a disaster. And interesting though, I did want to have children, or at least I had when I was very little. So when I was like elementary school, I had this idea that I was going to have a large family, like really a large family, like a dozen kids or something. But I didn't think about the partner. You know, like some little girls dream of their wedding day, and that wasn't me. Like I was not the teenager, and I know teenagers who are like this, who would get up every morning and think, okay, this is the day that I'm going to meet the man that I marry, kind of thing. That was just like not part of my thinking, you know. And part of it was that I did have a fear of men because of those early experiences. So maybe that was part of it. But I was really oriented towards saving the world, you know, towards being of service on a large scale. And I could only see that that could be done in conjunction with other like-minded people, which is how I ended up, you know, being part of several different spiritual communities. I had sworn off men, basically. If anyone expressed interest in me, I simply said, no, I'm not interested. And that would be the end of it. Nothing more would be said. So that went on for, you know, the first year and a half that I was in the community. And one day, I looked up and there was a man that I didn't recognize, who was about my age, who walked into the cafeteria. So we ate all our meals in a cafeteria. I didn't have a house that I lived in. I lived in like a triplex unit, which was, there was a bathroom and there was a bedroom, which I shared with someone else. But all of the food and the meals were communal. So I'm sitting in the cafeteria, eating a meal with my then best friend, and he comes walking into the cafeteria, and without stopping myself or stopping to think, I looked up and I said to her, "Who's that?" And I immediately thought, what do you care? You're not, you know, like you're the one who's not going to ever get married again and you're not interested. And I was like, gosh, that was weird. That was really out of character for me at that point. And so she told me, this, he just came from Norway. He's going to be working with us, you know, in the food services. It was a large department because the community was about 750 people. And then we had educational programs that we offered to members who were in the world, you know, like in all different places in the world, around the world, who would come usually 4 times a year, and we would have a conference, and there would be services and educational forums and that kind of thing. So we were cooking for 750 people, and most of those people were eating at least a couple meals a day. So you're talking about 1,500 to maybe 2,000 meals a day. So it was a big department, and he had come to work in the department. So I just sort of let it go. And then I noticed a few other things. You know, as time went on, we had binders where we kept all the prayers that we did regularly. One day I walked into the kitchen and there was a binder on the counter, and someone had taken this beautiful classical painting and had cut it apart so that it wrapped around this binder. I thought, wow, that is beautiful. Like, whose is that? Well, of course it was his. And we had music that would play while we were cooking. And it was spiritual music, classical music, for example. And one day I walked in and there was an absolutely beautiful piece on, and I said, wow, we would take turns, you know, whose turn it was to select the music. And I said, wow, who picked this music? And of course it was him. So I just sort of noticed these things. But we didn't have a conversation. You know, we were in some of the same groups because people who were newly arrived would have more education versus people who'd been there for many years that would have a lot of responsibility in their work, for example, or would be leading spiritual services. But we had Bible study, we had world religion study, you know, we had classes. So it was a smaller group, maybe 25 or 30 of us who were new and were part of about a year-long program where you got a lot of education as well as your service. So he was part of that. So I would see him regularly. And then one time when I was going to go home for Christmas, my parents, I didn't earn, I don't dinner and much at all at that point, if anything, for a salary. So my parents bought me a ticket so that I could fly home and spend Christmas with them. And so I was just in the kitchen in the bakery working, and he came over and said, "Oh, I heard you're going home to your parents for Christmas," and just talked for a few minutes. And I thought, well, that was actually unusual. I thought, I didn't think that he would notice if I was here or was not here. But I sort of made a mental note. And then because he was from Norway and he was on a work visa, he had a time limit for that. And once, he would have to go back to Norway at a certain point. So the other really important part of this story is that there was an Armageddon element to the community, that we did believe that there was a possibility of a third world war, which there still is the possibility of a third world war. My father was in the military, so I grew up with the sense that there could be war at any time. My father went to war. He went to Vietnam. So that wasn't a strange thing for me. So we were preparing, and there was great concern that there would be a war, and that it was safer to be where we were in Montana than it might be to be in Europe, for example. So I was concerned, if he went back to Europe, that maybe it would be a dangerous place to be. That was the concern. So there occasionally we would have a dance, so a rare social event. And if there was someone who was getting married, there would be a waltz associated with the wedding. And then we had a waltz so that some of the young people could get to meet each other, get to know each other. And then the idea also was that, well, one way that a person could stay here would be if they married an American. Well, of course, I didn't think it had anything to do with me because I had no intention of getting married. So we went to a waltz, and there were still regulations, like you were only supposed to dance with a particular partner not more than 3 times, so that you weren't, it was just these safeguards that were in place, or however you want to look at it, but it was so that you wouldn't develop a relationship with someone, outside of something that was approved, that was arranged. Some of those rules had been set aside at this point because of the situation of people who had come and who wanted to stay, who wanted to continue to be part of the community, but had a time limit on that. And so that evening, I was just dancing with whoever there was. I was part of the kitchen staff, so we were serving food, and when all the food was done, it was sort of the tag end of this event. And so I just went out and, was dancing with whoever asked, and didn't really pay that much attention to it. So we went back to the kitchen, and my friend who had been there when I had seen him the first time, she started commenting. She just was really, really having fun with the fact that she was watching like who was dancing with who and who was dancing with who, often, and that kind of stuff. So she was mentioning that someone had danced with this other person more than 3 times, and, and maybe they were interested in them. And I started thinking, I think I danced with Andrew. That's his current name. He had a Norwegian name, Øystein. So I think that I danced with Øystein a lot of times. And I started adding it up in my mind. I thought, good Lord, I think I danced with him like 7 times. I wonder if he's interested in me. Well, lo and behold, he had actually written the letter asking for permission to get to know me months and months before. Like, he arrived in June. By August, he had written this letter saying, I'm in love with her and I want to date her, and do I have permission? And he never heard anything back. Now, if you didn't hear back, the answer was no. So he had never approached me, to his credit, because I wouldn't have left. That was I was dedicated. That was what I was going to do. And I wouldn't have left for any man on earth, So because there was a language barrier, his primary language is Norwegian, he misunderstood and thought that he could just ask me to marry him. So I was completely unaware of this and really unaware of his feelings. And one day, shortly after that waltz, I was sitting in the cafeteria and he walked up and he sat down next to me, which was unusual, or sat down across from me. And I thought, what is he doing? Like, that's not allowed. And without any introduction, he said, "Will you marry me?" And I literally choked on my food. I was like, no, like I could be friends with you, but no, I'm not going to marry you. So I turned him down for the first time, and he didn't give up. Like, he went to someone who was involved in the marriage arrangements and said, I'm interested in her. So sure enough, the guru called me up. I'd never actually met her in person. I didn't interact with her. I was a kitchen worker. I wasn't like working with, working with the books she was writing, or working with the tours and the travel that she was doing, or TV shows or whatever. So she called me up, and I went and met her in person, and she asked me, was I interested in him? And I said no. And so we chatted for a few minutes, and she said, thank you for coming over to see me, and excused me. And then I really started thinking about it. I thought, well, if she's asking me, then maybe she thinks this would be a good match, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I am supposed to get married and have a large family someday, and I'm missing the cues here. So I really pondered it, and I was just, I'm the kind of person who can brood over things, and I always want to make the right decision, especially something like that, getting married. I mean, that's like, your marriage, your career, your children. I mean, those are the big deals in life. So I was just agonizing over this, and I was worried, what if I refused to marry him and he had to go back to Europe? And what if there was a war and he was killed? It would be all my fault. So you can see, I was like going down the rabbit hole pretty deep into this. And I could see that he was such a great person, just like he was cheerful. He was always helpful. He was just an upbeat kind of person. And then one day I saw him sitting in the cafeteria, and he had friends who were visiting, also Europeans who were visiting. And it was a young couple with a little baby sitting in a high chair. So there he was, they were eating their meal, and he could see that it was difficult for them, to pay attention to their meal. You know how it is if you've ever tried to eat in a public situation and you're trying to take care of a baby. So he pulls the high chair over close to him, and he starts feeding the baby so that they can eat in peace. I thought, wow, like this guy would be a great father, So now we had the art in common, we had the music in common. He looked like someone who would be a great father, because for me, if I was going to get married again, I was having a family. Like, I didn't just want a partner. Like, I'm sort of an all or nothing person. Like, I was either going to devote my life to God only, or I was going to go all the way, and I was going to have a family and be dedicated, to that as a way of serving, as a way of, developing your heart and loving and all of that. So anyway, so that was a major thing in his favor. And so finally, I wrote another letter to the guru and said, all right, here's my history. I've already had one marriage that was a disaster. I decided I would pledge my life to God. I came here to do that, but, I can see that this is a very fine person, and I understand that he'll have to leave if he doesn't get married, or if something else, significant doesn't change in his situation. He has written and says that he's in love with me, and even though at that time I wasn't in love with him, I just could see that he was really a wonderful man. So after I sent that letter, I got a call, and one of the ministers that worked with the guru, she called me into her office and said, yes, this marriage is God's will. this marriage is approved and this would be the right thing. And if you are now in agreement with it, since you already turned him down, you have to go and tell him that you'll marry him. So I go back to the kitchen. At this point, we would get about half a day off a month or something. I mean, we work 7 days a week, but you would get a small, like enough time to go to town if you needed to buy new clothing. We lived a good 2-hour round trip from the nearest decent sized town. And so you had a very small amount of time off. So I had been literally in bed sick, for days, like brooding over what should I do in this situation. And so I had gotten up, I showered, I got dressed. After, I met with with the assistant to the guru that gave me this message. And I went to the kitchen and said, where is Oystein? And so I was told, well, he's got a half day off. I was like, are you kidding me? Like 1 half day out of 30 days in the month, and it happens to be now when I'm going to tell him that I'm going to marry him. So I was told where he lived, which I didn't know. And it was a trailer similar to what I was living in. And so I went, I knocked on the door, he opened the door, and I said, if you still want to marry me, I'll marry you now. And he said, praise God. And that was the start of our marriage. We never been on a date. We never ate a meal together, nothing. I mean, I had observed him for about 10 months, at this point. And he'd already decided that he was in love with me. And so because he had that afternoon off and I was already on a sick day, we walked probably 1.5 miles down to a little restaurant where we could have tea together. And that was our first date. After we agreed to get married, that was our first date, was having tea together. And we actually were married 10 days later after that. So there wasn't, we went to town to get, I think you have to get like blood tests and stuff, before you get married. We had to make the legal arrangements. We found, there was a minister that was part of our spiritual community that was going to marry us. I found a secondhand wedding dress. I mean, everything happened in those 10 days. I called my parents. My mother, my father, and my grandmother all came. My friend who'd been sitting there when I first saw him, she was my bridesmaid, and then another friend of ours that worked with us in the kitchen became our best man. So all of these arrangements happened, and it was actually a beautiful wedding. There was a beautiful chapel that was part of the community. In fact, there was a couple of different chapels. So we were married in one of those. There were 2 other couples getting married, so it was a triple wedding, and it was beautiful. It's a beautiful chapel. We had a friend who did all the flowers for us. My husband made a wedding cake for us, and we had a reception behind the little restaurant, where we'd had our first date, where we had tea. And here we are 36 years later. So I know it was like a really unusual start to a marriage. And I'm not going to say that it was easy, but marriage isn't easy. Like we had the fundamentals in common. I told him before we got married, if we get married, we are going to have children. That's part of the deal for me. He was like, great, we have 5 children now. We had 2 children while we were still part of that community. We then left and had 3 more children after that. We've run a business together for many years, about 16 years. We worked together in business, and it's been really good. He is a wonderful person. If something was going to be arranged, maybe God did have a hand in it. I know there are Christian groups that I have watched videos online that do arrange marriages for their children. And I was like, oh, thank God, I mean, it's very unusual, but it's not totally out of the norm. I had a friend in high school who was from India, and when he graduated from college, I think from a master's degree, he went back to India. His family was there. His grandmother arranged interviews for him with quite a number of women. I heard 40, that sounds like a lot, but for quite a number. And he chose one, brought her back to America with him. They're still married. They have children. They have a happy life. He's been very successful. So it's not completely out of the norm, but it is out of the norm for someone like me, who was raised Catholic, middle-class family, military family, to go off to an ashram and then have an arranged marriage. And my parents were concerned about it because I'd already had the first marriage, which was a disaster. And when I called to tell them that I was getting married in 10 days, my dad freaked out. God bless him. He's passed away a few years ago, but he's like, she can't call me and tell me, she's getting married. So in the end, he did come to the wedding, and he said that when he met my husband, he talked to him for about 10 minutes, and he said, I knew everything would be okay. So now I'm going to get choked up because, as I said, it is my anniversary today, and it has been a great experience, and I'm perfectly happy that there was spiritual powers, a guru, other spiritual influences in my choice to go through with this. And people will say, but you married someone that you weren't in love with. And that is true. But that, I think, is how arranged marriages have been for the most part. And if it is a fine person, as obviously I could already see that he was, you do grow to love someone. And in fact, you may fall in love with that person 5 years later, 10 years later, 20 years later, So you can have the experience of falling in love. It just isn't necessarily the sequence that Hollywood puts out. And I'm grateful that I found a wonderful person, that we have supported each other, all these years, that we have had a wonderful life, both when we were in the community and when we left the community as well, that we were able to work out how do we live in the world together now that we're not in that structure. And we did work it out, and here we are. So sending love to my beloved husband, to my 5 children, and to everyone who was involved on earth and in heaven for arranging this marriage. Namaste.